So the Bills made it official on Friday that they signed wide receiver Curtis Samuel to a 3-year, $24 million contract worth up to $30 million. Now, I really like this because number one, the Bills added to the wide receiver room, and that was a pressing need going into this offseason. Number two, they got Josh Allen, a dynamic weapon. And number three, that dynamic weapon just so happened to have the best season of his career in 2020 when Joe Brady was his offensive coordinator. So if you look at his stats, Curtis Samuel has never really popped off aside from that 2020 season. And even then, his stats weren't, eye popping or anything. But it's important to note that the last five quarterbacks who threw him the ball were Sam Howell, Carson Wentz, Taylor Heineke, Teddy Bridgewater, and Kyle Allen. So I think that if you get him with Josh Allen, the sky is a limit because I think that Joe Brady is going to use him in a multitude of different ways where I have him slotting in as that wide receiver four. And Brandon Beane describes this as someone who has that inside outside versatility. He's essentially the first backup off the bench to come in and play, and you can use him in a variety of different packages. So that's how I see the Bills envision this here with Curtis Samuel, as you can play him in the slot. He can be that deep threat on the boundary. You can put him in the backfield. You can run the jet sweeps with him, and you can just use that quickness and the elusiveness to your advantage. But that's the thing. That's a lot of money for a wide receiver four / gadget type player here. Because if the Bills are giving him an AAV of $8 million per year, I just hope that means that that is a role that they have for him, and that's not going to prohibit them from drafting a wide receiver too. Because if you look at the depth chart here, I have Stephon Diggs as wide receiver one, Khalil Shakir as wide receiver three, and with the addition of Matt Collins, I have him battling out with Justin Shorter for those final two positions. And then, like I said with the tweet, Andy Isabella and KJ Hamler are there as well. So, Samuel slots in as wide receiver four for me because I am still on the wide receiver train. I want Brandon Beane to do something that he's never done in his Bills tenure, and that is draft a wide receiver before day 3. I want to find that wide receiver two, hopefully in round 1, maybe round 2, but either way, the Bills need to add another wide receiver in this draft, in this loaded draft of wide receiver talent. Now, it's important to note that the Bills pivoted because shortly before, it was reported that they had signed defensive tackle Eric Armstead. Now, Diana Rossini corrected herself just a couple minutes later, and she said, "My apologies. He actually signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars." Now, the Jaguars gave him a 3-year, $51 million contract with an AAV of $17 million per year. So, we talked about this on the show the other night, and we said that we would love Eric Armstead, but not for that price. So the Bills pivoted, and they gave about half that money to Curtis Samuel. Now, again, this is interesting because they still haven't addressed safety. They did re-sign Taylor Rapp. I like that. They re-signed Cam Lewis, but those guys aren't needle movers for me. If you're going to replace Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer, you have to go get, I'm not going to say a stud because Justin Simmons is still out there, and I'm not sure if the money's there, but you at least have to replace those guys with someone a little bit above a Taylor Rapp talent. And that's nothing against Taylor Rapp, but I see Taylor Rapp as a safety 2, safety 3. And if you look at his contract, 3 years, a little bit over $10 million, that's pretty much how they paid him. So I think based on how they structure that contract, the Bills set themselves up to be able to sign a safety and then draft another one. And then you have Taylor Rapp kind of as that fringe starter. But yet we haven't had the news break that the Bills are signing a safety, and maybe that's still to come. But now the market's starting to dry up a little bit as Justin Simmons and Julian Blackmon are the top safeties available, but how much money are they going to want? So now I think that the focus has to shift down to a mid-tier safety, and someone I like here is Mike Edwards. He fits the Bills window, 27 years old, coming off of a 1-year deal with Kansas City following his first few years with Tampa Bay. And I think if you can pluck him off the Chiefs roster and if you can pick his brain about how to beat Kansas City, I think that could be a sneaky move. So then you draft another one, and now that safety room is starting to look pretty good and coming into form when you have the rookie Mike Edwards, Taylor Rapp, and then DeMar Hamlin and Cam Lewis kind of on that back half. That being said, I think that they're going to get a lower tier defensive tackle as well. Field Yates reported Friday that they hosted Sebastian Joseph Day on a free agent visit, and I think he would be perfect as this is a guy who's 28 years old, 6'4", 310 pounds. He's good for 2 to 3 sacks a season on top of 40 to 50 tackles. And I think he'd be that key veteran rotational piece that you can plug in behind Ed Oliver and Daquan Jones, because after the Bills re-signed Daquan Jones, that solidified the middle. You have Ed Oliver and Daquan back for 2 years, but you need to get that depth. And I think that the Bills will also draft a defensive tackle, but you need to build behind those guys because we saw what happened with the injuries over the last couple of seasons. Now, someone else who I really like is Adam Butler. I think this is a guy who has a lot of upside. He had 5 sacks and 28 tackles in 0 starts this year for the Raiders. So he was that rotational piece who really made the most of his opportunities. And this comes after he started his career with New England. And this is also a guy who, in 97 games, he's only made 13 career starts, but in those games, he's recorded 141 tackles and 22 sacks. So again, I think this is a guy who would make the most of his opportunities. And someone else, speaking of New England, they released Lawrence Guy. I think he could be a key rotational piece. He still has some juice left in him, and I think he would know his role. Maybe, I don't know his market, but I think you could get him on a relatively cheap deal, and he could help plug up the middle. And one other position that I think needs to get addressed is running back, specifically RB2. Now, the Bills did re-sign Ty Johnson, and I love that because I think he immediately slots in as RB3 now that Nyheim Hines is in Cleveland back with Ken Dorsey. So if you have James Cook as RB1, Ty Johnson as RB3, I'm looking at either Deontay Foreman or Ezekiel Elliott as RB2. I want a big north to south back, that big bruiser who can help take the pressure off of Josh Allen in those short yardage situations. And he can also take the pressure off in pass protection as well. So you could easily say that the Bills will go draft that bigger running back. But I think this is a valuable position that the Bills will say, you know what? We're only paying James Cook $1.6 million, at least against the cap. Ty Johnson, we haven't seen his contract details yet, but I would be stunned if it's more than $2 million. So you could potentially get 3 really good running backs here for less than $6 million total. And some of these teams are paying their running backs double figures just for one guy. So I think that would be a very smart allocation of their resources if you can get someone like Deontay Foreman here on a 1-year, $2 million deal. Now, as you see at the bottom here, the Bills also signed Nicholas Morrow and Mac Hollins. I touched on Hollins earlier. I think this is a nice Gabe Davis replacement and Trent Sherfield, as Hollins can block and play special teams. So when the Bills first signed him, I was like, Mac Hollins, what are we doing here? But then I was like, okay, wait a sec. This is early. This is just to fill out that depth. And now you see how it's coming into form with the Curtis Samuel addition. Now, as for Nicholas Morrow, I really like that one because he is essentially the Tyrell Dodson replacement, as Dodson ended up signing with the Seahawks. Now, Morrow wore the green dot for the Eagles this past season, and he has that inside-outside flexibility where he can play middle linebacker or weak side linebacker. And this past season in Philadelphia, he had 95 tackles and 3 sacks. And this is a year after he finished with a career-high 116 tackles in Chicago. So I think if you pair him with Dorian Williams as your second-string linebackers behind Terrell Bernard and Matt Milano, with Balin Spector still sitting there, I think that room is pretty much set. So just to wrap this up, I think that safety is the main position here that the Bills need to address. I think they need to touch up the defensive line. Speaking of touching up, let me just talk about defensive end real quick, because the Bills did re-sign AJ Epinesa. That was also a key signing right there. So now if you have Von Miller, Greg Rousseau, AJ Epinesa, and Kingsley Jonathan, I think that the Bills are in pretty good shape, but I see room for one more. Will that be Shaq Lawson coming back on a cheap deal once the market starts to dry up? Will they draft one? Time will tell, but I don't think that position is as big to address as defensive tackle, as they only have 2 on the roster right now. And then Eli Ankou kind of floats around. So I think from here on out, the next position that gets filled is safety, followed by defensive tackle, and then running back. Now, it doesn't have to be in that order, but I think those are the 3 positions that Brandon Beane is going to address as we move along here in free agency.